and Catholicism. On today's episode, we'll hear from a Catholic bishop and a former member of the British Armed Forces talking about our duties as Christians, striving to walk the path to heaven, and how does that square with the hell of war?
That's what they say, war is hell. So it's a terrible scenario for anybody to be placed into. It should always be the last resort.
It's not an easy one to answer, really, is it? It's the $64,000 question. I don't have the answer. I mean, I think for me it was always a case of, what is it that we're fighting for?
Welcome to the Faithful Podcast, especially new followers and subscribers. I'm your host, Tony Ganzer, and this is a big topic with many twists and turns, so we'll attempt to somewhat narrow our conversation today, and it will be driven by a single line of movie dialogue. Your quality will be known among your enemies before ever you meet them. For me, there is so much packed into this line from a movie called Kingdom of Heaven. A newly minted Christian knight during the Crusades named Balian, played by Orlando Bloom, had just released a Saracen, or Muslim fighter, on account of his quality, when the man, Imad ad-Din al-Isfahani, delivers this line.
Your quality will be known among your enemies before ever you meet them, my friend.
Balian had inherited his estranged father's nobility as Baron of Ibelin and was shipwrecked while journeying to Jerusalem. A lone surviving horse from the wreck runs into an oasis in a desert plot of land owned by what we're told is al-Isfahani's master. Balian refuses to give up the horse, and al-Isfahani's master fights for it and loses. Balian spares al-Isfahani's life and orders him to guide him to Jerusalem, and once there, he releases him and gives him the horse, kind of a bonus. Al-Isfahani is stunned, saying Balian could have kept him as a slave, which Balian rejects. He had been one, or near to a slave in his life, and he would never hold someone in that state. And that's when we hear it.
Your quality will be known among your enemies before ever you meet them, my friend.
A Catholic military perspective on quality, honor, and mercy. That's in this episode of Faithful. As I record this episode, we're still seeing the devastation of the war in Ukraine, just as we've seen devastation in Afghanistan, Iraq, Ethiopia, Yemen. The list is as long as the existence of humanity. But really, where is humanity in war? What about mercy, honor, nobility? The topic is huge, and I want to say at the outset, I can't cover it all. St. Augustine's thought on just war theory, the Catholic Church's teachings on self-defense and preservation of life and peace cannot be discussed comprehensively, at least by me, in a single session. I'm also not a veteran, but I've interviewed many in my career as a journalist. I have friends and family in the services. You may also remember talking through some of these issues in our episode with Father Cirilo Nacorda, who was held hostage by terrorists in the Philippines at one time, and later he was carrying a gun, helping villagers defend themselves. I've always struggled with this tension between being called to love our enemies and also needing an armed forces to face our enemies on the battlefield. To help us think through what's going on here, we have Bishop Neal Buckon of the Archdiocese of the Military, USA. He's also from Cleveland, where I'm based, so he gets extra points for that. But first, let's hear from a good friend of mine who is former military and Catholic, Rebecca Clemenz.
Born and raised in England, although I'm living in Switzerland now. I was at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst in 1997, where I did my officer training and spent 3 years as a troop commander. My specialization was in logistics, specifically setting up seaports and airports, generally working with NATO and the Allied Command Europe Mobile Forces, the US military as well, and just, organizing so those big ships and big planes can arrive with all of the myriad of wonderful things they bring. I was actually raised in the Anglican Church and became Catholic in 2002. So this is my 20-year anniversary of becoming a Catholic. And with the military connection, I actually stumbled across the faith in a bar in Rome one evening. After I left the military, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. So I put a pin in the map, said, well, I've never been to Rome, and off I went. And 2 years into that Rome adventure, I walked into a bar in Trastevere and met some seminarians from the Pontifical North American College, some of whom were also ex-military, ex-Navy, ex-Army, and the rest is history, as they say. So, and now I'm in Switzerland with my husband. We have 4 children, and I'm currently working as a teacher, actually. So
wow. And congrats on 20 years. That's great.
Thank you. I feel like I'm a Catholic adult now.
That's right. I'm still getting there.
Yep.
With both Rebecca and Bishop Buckon, who we'll hear later in the episode, we sat and watched that scene from Kingdom of Heaven together to refresh the images in our minds and then jump right into a conversation. I encourage you to check out the movie if you haven't seen it. It's one of my favorites. It's on my list of top movies. So I began with Rebecca just for her first thoughts on what we had just watched.
The first thing that struck me about it, I was thinking about St. Thomas Aquinas when he was commenting, I believe it was one of Aristotle's works. He wrote that the thing that separates humans from animals, or one of the many things, is that when animals are confronted with a dangerous or new situation, they instinctively react to protect or defend or to fight. And the quality of a human society and what we seek when we're looking for justice is communication. And we try to understand the other, we try to listen to the other. And it was interesting that once this sort of original confrontation occurred, right? And he said, this is my horse. No, you have to give it back. It belongs to me. And this very sort of primitive, or this very basic, this is, you see it in toddlers a lot, right? No, this is mine. No, it's mine. We must punch each other and one of us will win. And really the mark of humanity is what really comes afterwards, this sort of step into rationality of, no, you won't be my slave. You won't be my prisoner. We're seeking justice. And this time spent riding together through the desert, returning to Jerusalem. And it just struck me that having read similar things in St. Thomas Aquinas, that this desire to communicate and understand the other is really the very essence of what it means to be a human being and to have human nature.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because even though there's opposition here, that we're on two sides of a conflict, at some point you get to the level where you recognize, at least as demonstrated in the scene, that we are human. There's mutual respect for the shared humanity in both of us. And then from a Christian perspective, the image and likeness of God in each other, even when we're opposed on the battlefield. And that, I think, superficially might look like a contradiction, that we're opposed in some way, but then we have this shared reality and existence.
Yep. No, for sure. No, I agree. And I think it's always interesting in that, I was not obviously ever in a combat role in my role in the military, but one of the questions they ask you when they join is, could you ever fire a gun at someone? And for me, the answer was very clearly, well, I would fire back. I know Pope Francis has recently sort of re-understood the church's teaching on these concepts of things like a just war and things like that. And defense is really the only room he leaves for any sort of concept of just war, is the ability to defend oneself. Obviously the elephant in the room for all of us at the moment, of course, is the war in the Ukraine. And the conversations I have with people, no one can understand how in 2022, we have a situation that we find ourselves in right now. And I think going on the back of the wars we've had in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and all those other things, and trying to learn lessons from things that went wrong in that time. But as you say, it's this experience of the meeting of people. And as well, I've lived in a couple of different countries, you have as well. And so very much of what we fear and what we dislike of other people is simply what we don't know about them. And when you speak to people, you find that the things you thought were differences and the things you thought were problems and the things you thought were insurmountable problems and things we should probably fight about. When you sit down and talk to someone, you actually find that we have much more in common than we could have imagined. And as you say, this common humanity, this viewing the world as a created child of God, with our common goal of seeking God as our ultimate good together.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You know, part of the contradiction, at least for me, is juxtaposing realpolitik and kind of what we know from modern society and diplomacy and nation states and things to our responsibility as Christians, I guess you could say, because we're called to love our enemies, and to love someone is to will the good of the other.
Yeah.
How do we will the good of someone who is a declared enemy? How does that square from the military perspective, especially when you're trying to balance your duty with also your duty to God and your faith?
Sure. No, and I mean, I think it's not an easy one to answer, really, is it? It's sort of the $64,000 question. I don't have the answer. I mean, I think for me, it was always a case of, what is it that we're fighting for? And in the military, the individual soldiers, they don't have that freedom of conscience really anymore. When you sign up, you join up, you have a chain of command, you're following the orders of the people above you. But I think for me, the only thing that I think you can do is in those one-on-one situations, where as a soldier you're involved in a civilian population. And in those moments, you can't have that connection perhaps with the enemy combatant as directly, but in the situations where you're confronted with civilians or prisoners of war, in those sort of situations, I think that's really the moment where you can build you have famous stories from the Second World War of the German and English soldiers playing cricket and, celebrating Christmas Day together and things like that. And I think it's those moments where on an individual level, you can say, well, when I had the freedom as a soldier to make a choice, in that moment, I chose the good, and I chose the good for my enemy, even though the next day we picked up rifles and were shooting each other again, because those are my orders. And that's what I promised to do when I signed up.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. In this movie, I don't want to give too many spoilers, but this act of mercy comes back, and it pays off well for Balian, the main Christian knight, played by Orlando Bloom. And I'm reminded of a passage in Sirach. I'm going to read it here. The kindness people have done crosses their paths later on. Should they stumble, they will find support. Mm-hmm. And that really struck me, especially in this situation. I wonder if you have any reflections on that.
Right. Well, I think, I study with Dominicans, so intention is everything, right? Why am I doing this good deed? Am I doing it so that at some unknown point in the future, someone will be nice to me back? We've all been there, sat in the traffic jam, someone's trying to come in from the side, and you think, well, I'll let this person in because maybe next time I'll be the guy sitting trying to join the queue and someone will be nice to me. But I think the Catholic view of it, and ultimately what we're aiming for, is doing the good for the sake of the good itself, and not in the hope of some future reward. We seek the good because it's what our soul desires, what our intellect desires, what our will desires, and we seek to do the good for its own sake, not for the sake of a future reward or to receive it back in some way.
Yeah, I guess that extends to, if you were to take let's say a Buddhist view, for example, that it's all about karma,
Sure.
What goes around comes around. But really, from the Catholic perspective, what we're saying is good is good. There is truth, there is right action. And really the responsibility is to do that, whether or not there is a direct reward, so to say, for yourself.
Well, and when you think of the life of Christ, right, he went around healing the sick, curing, he doing miracles and wonderful things. And he certainly didn't have that, the karma wasn't there in his life, right? In the end, he's crucified. It's, and I think that's what the Christian ideal is we do good anyway. We do good anyway, because it's the right thing to do. And it's the ultimate, God is good, and we ultimately seek to be with him.
Yeah. Being noble, being honorable, we often hear these words used when we think about chivalry, medieval times and things. Can you, in a way, bring that to the modern military perspective? Is it a similar idea that, you have in this scene the call, fight me fairly, I'm nobility as well? does that exist anymore, or has warfare and the role of militaries changed so much that it's not necessarily a one-to-one as often, perhaps?
Yeah, no, and I agree. And I think also what has fundamentally changed in the concept of modern warfare is who the enemy is. And previously, when you think, I mean, even just 100 years ago, England and the US were fighting Germany, and the enemy was very, very, very clear. And now the enemy is an ideology that's hiding within a population. And it's much, much harder to target that. It's much harder to target that. It's yeah, and so I mean we've seen ourselves in, I mean, I think the thing with Russia is maybe shifted the paradigm a little bit again, but I think in the situations we've seen in the Middle East and recent conflicts, the enemy hasn't been clear. We don't know exactly. We're fighting an ideology rather than a political party or a specific evil or an evil nation as we've previously understood it in that way. And I think the nature of warfare, and certainly the way soldiers are trained for warfare, has changed dramatically over the last 2 decades, even in that short period of time, in the last period of time, because we're not fighting the same enemy. It's not rows of trenches, rows of tanks, rows of artillery anymore. You're fighting an insurgent, a terrorist, a single individual that's seeking to destroy something rather than an army or a specific power.
Mm-hmm. To pick up on something you said a bit earlier, you were talking about how, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's about the agency that we have in a moment. And that's really where our responsibility comes in as Catholics, to try to make the best decision we can. Can you talk a little bit more about the idea of mercy, both in the military context, but also just in life, that there are opportunities to show mercy to others? And I guess I'm extending the use of enemy very broadly, but people who come across our paths who are maybe challenging on our spiritual journey, right?
Well, and one of the things, I gave up Facebook a couple of years ago, but one of the things I saw frequently going around Facebook, and it made me so furious, was one of these memes, and it has a 6 and someone saying it's a 6, and then someone standing the other end saying it's a 9, and then the thing goes, well, they're both right. And and there's another one where there's sort of a couple of men standing around an elephant, and one says it's a hose pipe, and the other is and for me, I think it's really just intellectual laziness. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. When you see something that is contradictory, when you see something that I say it's a 6, you say it's a 9, in all likelihood, we're both wrong. And I think having the humility to take a step back, look at the bigger picture. When I put together my hose pipe and my fan and my tree trunk and my rope, oh, actually what I have is an elephant. I don't have any of these individual things. And when we look at the 6 or the 9 thing, maybe we need to take a step back and look for other points to orientate ourselves. And I truly think this quest for the truth, not to get off topic, but I feel like very often today we sort of say, well, this is my truth, and this is your truth, and both of these things have equal value, and both of these things are also objectively true, even though they're contradictory. And I think in today's society, we have more than enough opportunities every day of meeting people that say strange things or have what seem to be very opposing views of what the truth actually is. And I think for modern Catholics and modern Christians especially, it's having that courage to engage in the dialogue and say, well, when you say that, what do you mean? How do you say that? And not because I'm right, I'm also learning from you. We're seeking the truth, written with capital letters, together. And I think we have to avoid this trap of sort of intellectual laziness of saying, well, if it's true for you and it's true for me and something else is true for him and it's all true, isn't that lovely? When in fact, we know that's not the case. There is the truth. We believe in the existence of an ultimate truth and of God, and as Christ said, you can know the truth and the truth will set you free.
Yeah, I don't think you went on a tangent there at all, because honestly, when I think about some of the, you could say, assumptions about Catholicism, it's that we as Catholics are just following rules and we're not independent thinkers, even though there is a tradition of really trying to reason our way to faith as well. And some people think reason and faith are opposed, but really questioning that is part of our spiritual journey. And that applies whether we're on a battlefield a literal battlefield or in a spiritual battlefield every single day.
Yep, absolutely. No, for sure. No, and I mean, I know when I came to the faith, it was very much a process of studying and learning and reading and looking up the footnotes and figuring it out. And it's one of, I mean, it's fascinating and frustrating, but fascinating that, again, in today's society, you see people like, well, you either believe or you're a scientist. And this idea that these things are opposed, and you think, goodness, we believe that God created the world. When science investigates the world, it should be impossible for it to come up with something that contradicts our faith, because we believe that God created the world. And therefore, science must reveal the truth about God to us and must reveal the truth about the created world to us, because otherwise my faith is meaningless and it doesn't make sense. And I think it's also having the courage to say, well, maybe something doesn't seem to make sense, but having the courage to say, well, then I need to read further. I need to, as the same with the 6 and 9 thing, I need to look at the bigger picture, find out more. And I think very often when you find that there's something that doesn't make sense, the lacking is with me and my understanding, not with the thing that doesn't make sense, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. To bring it back to this quote in this scene, your quality will be known among your enemies before ever you meet them. I also am reminded that we as Catholics can show our faith by living the gospel, and people will know our quality based on how we express our faith in our actions. Do you think that's an accurate connection to make to this scene?
What does it say? Francis said, preach the gospel, if necessary, use words, right?
Right.
And I think that is as true today as it was then as well. And I think there has to be something that, my 2 youngest are preparing for their first communion, and in the little book they're studying from, it says, people should look at you and say, wow, that's a first communion child. There should be your joy at receiving this sacrament, your joy at this union with Christ should be something that's visible to people, and spürbar in German, right? And something that people something concrete, something that they can touch and feel. And I think that's for all of us as well. I mean, it's a very dear friend of mine many years ago said to me in Rome, she said, my only hope as a Catholic is that when people go home in the evening and they say, well, Catholics, they this, they say, well, they can think about me and think, well, hang on, she isn't like that. Maybe there's something there I need to find out something more about. And that was really something that I took to heart. And, I think that's such good advice. And it's not that we have to be out there sort of waving around rosary beads and quoting the Bible at people, but the way we live should be the gospel message in and of itself.
Yeah, but if you want to wave around rosary beads, you can do that too.
You can do that too. Yeah, sure. Go for it.
My thanks to Rebecca Clemenz for that conversation and so many good thoughts. This discussion of war, of faith, of mercy, honor, duty. As I mentioned at the start, there are many elements to consider, and we can only touch on some of them. But often the issue comes down to life and death, in the literal sense of physical threat to life, obligation to preserve and defend your own life or that of innocence, but also your eternal life in the Catholic view. How do we function and behave in accordance with Christ's teaching? Bishop Neal Buckon is from the Archdiocese and the Military Services, USA. And in thinking about that kingdom of heaven scene that's spurring on this episode for us today, he tells us to remember that was a life and death situation right from the start.
The desert can be most inhospitable. And well, he may have known, if I give up my horse, I give up my life here. So he may have been fighting for his life. And that's one of the things that we believe is that we have a right to defend ourselves and defend our lives. Again, an unfortunate loss of life that we saw displayed in the movie, but I think that the knight had the obligation to preserve his own life as best he can.
The main quote we're focusing on for this episode about quality being known among your enemies inspired in the bishop a thought to the modern context of values that are prized by the U.S. Armed Forces, for example, including loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, integrity, courage, commitment, highlighted depending on the branch. You get the idea.
So these are the values that each one of the services try to inculcate in all of the people that join these services. So right from the initial entry, they're at basic training. Everybody gets introduced to these values. So if they don't already have these values, the military wants to try to instill these values into them. So that, yes, everybody would know when they see a soldier, or when they see a sailor, well, these are the values that should define who this individual is. So I think that even the enemies would know, okay, well, this is what we can expect from an American soldier.
Bishop Buckon also reminded me of the importance of the rules of engagement for service members as a demonstration of discipline and a set of principles that are supposed to guide interactions, especially in heated situations.
And I would like to think that our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, now we also have the Space Force, the Guardians, not the new Cleveland team, but the new military service, that these folks will exercise their duties with respect to the law of land warfare and the rules of engagement. So they have a framework in which they're supposed to be following orders and conducting operations in our national security. And so they're not supposed to be operating as lone rangers out there. They're supposed to be team players following the laws of land warfare and the rules of engagement.
Sure. That prompts me to wonder about if we're to follow a code, both service members are following a code, but also as Catholics, as Christians, we have to follow a code as well. How does that interact maybe with people who oppose us, who don't share those codes, right? And would maybe take advantage of knowing the codes that we live by? How do we weigh that in the Christian sense of knowing someone may take advantage of the fact that we follow rules and we respect life and truth above all things?
That's the thing. We don't want to surrender the moral high ground. It's important to be true to oneself and to one's calling as you go about this business. And so that's something that I think we as Americans, as an American people, want to do, is make sure that we have elected officials who oversee military operations that are wanting to hold this moral high ground. So yes, the military is held accountable to the Congress and the Senate. The commander-in-chief is the President of the United States. So it's a key and essential for our country to have people who are moral.
And there are a number of Catholics in these roles, which the bishop seemed proud to say. But ultimately, war is difficult and a test on us individually and collectively. And to love our enemies, willing their good, it's just a rough spot.
It's it's just a terrible, that's what they say, war is hell. So it's a terrible scenario for anybody to be placed into. It should always be the last resort. So I think it's very, very difficult too. So like Afghanistan and Iraq, the enemy, they were not wearing a uniform. They were dressed as locals in the neighborhood. So they were very, very difficult to identify. Not an easy task or an easy situation.
And of course, now Europe is still reeling with the effects of the war in Ukraine. Bishop Buckon pointed to the aggression shown against Ukraine by Russia as a clear provocation, which provides space for Ukraine to defend itself under just war theory. But not all wars are created equal.
When we look at what's going on in the Ukraine right now, we could see that we had a sovereign nation that was attacked, invaded by another country. I mean, the people that are fighting in the Ukraine, they're fighting for their lives, their families, and their neighborhoods. So I think when St. Augustine penned his just war criteria, he had this kind of scenario in mind. Unfortunately, when we went into Iraq in 2003, the Holy Father, Pope John Paul II, now St. John Paul, he had said, well, we have not yet reached last resort. Mm-hmm. So we had the Holy Father at that point in time saying that in the application of the just war criteria, the criteria had not been met, which it does present us with a moral dilemma. I know there were service members who were struggling with their conscience with respect to this, feeling, okay, well, I raised my hand, I put on the uniform, I swore that I would obey the orders of those appointed over me. But now the spiritual leader of the Catholic Church is sending me a different message here. Yeah. So there is that tension that we spoke about. By and large, most of the people that I work with, they love God, they love their country, they love their little chapel, and they want to do the right thing, always and everywhere. And but unfortunately, not everybody thinks like we do, and I think that's what we're seeing in a situation like the invasion of the Ukraine here.
Bishop Buckon says it's important to have people with values and clear thinking in command roles because acting with emotion can lead to escalation of conflicts, as he saw in his many years traveling with troops in conflict zones. But those values also play out in non-combat missions, the humanitarian missions, goodwill missions that demonstrate the quality of armed forces and our society just by our actions.
Let's take a look at the Afghan refugees. So the first Sunday of Advent, I visited Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico. And there on the base, they have Douglas Village. And in Douglas Village, they have 3,000 guests. Hmm. The guests are Afghan refugees. More than half of them are children, so they came as families. They left Afghanistan because they felt like, there's no future for us here. Maybe the Taliban even has us in their crosshairs. In other words, they might be wanting to target our family here. So The whole family kind of became a family of refugees to be resettled in the United States. So I'll spend 6 months there in the refugee camp. And well, anyways, I went to visit the camp after celebrating the first Sunday of Advent. And the mayor of the camp is an Air Force major, and Air Force personnel are running the camp. And it's a tent city.
Mm.
And there's several different agencies that work there. One of them is Migration Refugee Services from the USCCB. So they have the morale, welfare, recreation part. And it was nice to see their tent and their participation in the effort. But anyways, there's a mosque in the camp. The call to prayer could be heard, and we heard it while we were visiting. The kids were being kids. They were running around and laughing and playing games. Some were holding hands with the airmen. And I was thinking, for an 8-year-old, when they come here to the United States and they go into one of these villages, they're probably thinking, oh, they're here too. In other words, they saw them over there in their country, and now they come here to the United States. They go to the village, and there's a uniformed American service member. And so it was just endearing to see children holding the hands of uniformed airmen and walking around in these playgrounds.
We can only control ourselves, our actions, and our interactions with each other. And how we will be judged is by how we act and have acted and who we are really. And these actions should be done with humility, anything we do. There's a difference between earning your reputation and demonstrating your values through action or just telling people about it. If we were to be judged on our lives up to this point or any point in the future, can we stand up and really say, we are excellent? In my opinion, everyone's truthful answer should be no, but I tried my best. And that effort to be a good Christian, a good Catholic, should be the best we can give at any one moment, whether it's on a literal battlefield or a spiritual one that we visit every day.
Your quality will be known among your enemies before ever you meet them, my friend.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Faithful Podcast. Please like and subscribe on iTunes, YouTube, wherever you like. I appreciate it. Also, please share episodes on social media. I sure appreciate hearing from listeners and seeing these conversations out in the wild, as it were. And please remember to stay safe and have a great day.